So I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about the HITRUST E1, HIPAA, and AI security. I'm Sean Dowling, Vice President here at Accorian. And also joining me is Megan Taylor. She's the team lead and customer solution expert at ZenGRC. I'm going to be covering kind of the backbone of the HITRUST E1, HIPAA, AI security, go through the framework stuff. And then Megan's going to talk, about how all that comes together inside of the ZenGRC tool itself and what they can do to help, work with organizations on streamlining the process and then what we do as a partner with them and to work with you as well. So we're going to, cover several topics today. We'll go through these fairly quickly. If you're looking for more detail about any specific topic or the overall, we'll be happy to set up some more time to go through these with you. But we're going to start with why the HITRUST E1 is really gaining a lot of traction over the last year or so in the healthcare community. I will touch on a little bit. It's also gaining traction in other areas like finance and manufacturing. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is and how that's starting to unfold. We'll look at where HIPAA and HITRUST overlap and work together, and how AI security is expanding the compliance boundary. So we'll talk a lot more about the tooling and stuff like that from that perspective when identifying your evidence and being able to use AI in some areas where improving the evidence or the evidence collection process may be beneficial for you. The second half of the session, we're going to shift from requirements to execution. We're going to talk about evidence strategy, lessons from client journeys, timeline, risk, things like that. And we'll get more into how Accorian and our service line with being the assessor kind of goes hand in hand with ZenGRC and how we work together to deliver these projects as seamlessly as we possibly can for you. So let's get started. We'll talk right now. We're going to jump into a little bit about HIPAA itself and HITRUST and how it all lives together. In most cases, many organizations, HIPAA is owned by the legal or the privacy side of the house. HITRUST, or like your certification side, is owned by your security or InfoSec side. So in a lot of situations, the two sides don't really start talking until they're having to go through some sort of an assessment, like a HIPAA risk assessment or a HITRUST assessment that has the HIPAA controls laid out together with them. Both groups are often asked to do the same thing or provide the same evidence. And that becomes problematic because you find yourself having to do the same thing, multiple cycles. And if you have multiple applications or environments that are under the assessment, you find yourself going and pulling the same thing 2, 3, 4 times. So that's one of the areas where, we want to look at, ZenGRC being able to help, streamline that process where you pull the evidence once and it's used across multiple frameworks or not multiple controls or multiple frameworks. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It also creates, that this process creates a lot of inefficiency. It's inconsistent. And what we end up seeing is, even though a lot of organizations are relatively pulling the same evidence, the evidence is different. So depends on who pulled it, where they got it, when they got it. So a lot of times, we'll see a lot of inconsistencies with the evidence itself. So we want to make sure that, we're addressing these concerns up front and working with you on what evidence needs to be pulled, how to do that, where it needs to be pulled from, and then just making sure that, like using ZenGRC, we have the ability to reuse that evidence as needed. So again, we're trying not to merge the roles of legal, privacy, security, but we're trying to create a systematic approach that allows them to sync together. Okay. So HIPAA and HITRUST kind of go hand in hand now. HITRUST was founded back in 2007, and what they did was they went out and got a whole bunch of the standards, the controls that most organizations from a healthcare side of the house should have been following or needed to be following, and they kind of created their own flair of that. And then right on top of that, they came back with, hey, if we're going to do all this for the healthcare world, we need to do it for HIPAA as well. So we had the ability to bring HIPAA controls into a high trust assessment. Specifically, the E1, we had the capability of going in and saying, you know what, we're gonna do the E1, but then we're gonna bring in some additional controls that allows you to look at your breach notification, your security, your base security, and your privacy information that would need to be reported out in your HIPAA risk assessment. So the great thing about using HITRUST is all that process is actually built in directly with the tool itself. Um, we shouldn't be treating anything here like HIPAA, HITRUST E1s, or your AI, security separately. They have different needs, different obligations, but they rely mainly on the same operational capabilities. So what we want to make sure is that we're building a very, layered level assessment, that we're going in and we're looking at the same things for each one of these at the same time. So things like, your operational capabilities like risk assessments or access control, inventories for your assets, your vendor management, anything from that perspective. We want to make sure that commonality that's happening across these different frameworks is being looked at the same light in the same way. So when they're using a common backbone like HITRUST, that gives us the ability to sit there and say, all right, we're looking at this control, and this control covers everything here for what the HITRUST control is, but it also covers, these privacy controls or these security or breach notification controls in HIPAA. It covers, where we are, from an AI perspective. And I'll get a little bit more into the AI side of the house, because with HITRUST, there's a lot more involved. But we can add in those AI controls that allows, that seamless, look across those frameworks. Okay. So why is HITRUST E1 gaining, traction now? It's really simple. There really isn't anything else out there that offers this level of assurance in the healthcare world to start with, and allows an organization to test their security program at this detailed level. In the past, we've had things like SOC 2s and ISOs, which kind of touch on it, but both of those are set up as, hey, what were you doing yesterday in your security program? And it wasn't really helping you build out your program. Where HITRUST, has put in a forward-looking process. So we are going to go say, hey, what are you doing now? What did you do yesterday? But we're also going to make sure that you understand how to run your program, and how each one of these controls need to be implemented, throughout your organization. So then you can be forward thinking with this. And then there's, some additional reviews and things like that need to take place. But some of the advantages we see with the E1, which came out about 2 years ago, is, today with the version 11.8, and going forward, it's 43 controls. But there's about 260, I think, 250 sub controls built into those 43 controls. So it is a full, thorough look at your program, but it rolls it up in a manner in which it makes it fast. It makes it a lot easier. If you've done HITRUST in the past, you've dealt with, the R2, which is the big assessment, where a lot of times you end up getting 300, 400, 500 plus controls, and it takes forever to get through those. What HITRUST was able to do was to narrow down the E1 to the essentials. Here are the core baseline, hygiene-based, controls that if your organization is following, you will be relatively secure. It won't be 100%, because there are additional things that need to be addressed there. But it does allow the organization to get through the process quicker. It makes it a more affordable approach, a more time consistent approach, where we can, look at the organization and say, hey, is this good enough, or is this just a foundational step to build into that? Okay. So and it brings in a couple other things there where we do look at the vendors. So your TPRM program, we're going to look at. We are going to look at your where the organization is today and try to get you in a common starting point. We want to make sure that you understand that in most organizations, especially those organizations that handle PHI or process PHI, the E1 is a starting point. It's not the end goal. In many cases, you're probably going to have to go a little deeper down the road, but at least it gets you to a common starting point with a certification and some level of assurance that your organization's on the right path and you are relatively secure. Um, so with the E1, my key message here is, it's not just a lighter assessment. It's a practical way to establish and improve a baseline compliance foundation. So again, it's really giving you kind of that kickstart into your security program and making sure that you're following along with it. We are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, the E1 not only getting traction in the healthcare community, which is where HITRUST is basically has their bread and butter, but we are seeing it in finance. We are seeing it in other areas like manufacturing, where we can take these controls and we can pick them up and put them over top of almost any type of organization and look at the security program from that perspective and give you a baseline security, foundational approach. So again, it's not just tied to the healthcare community here. All right. So, one of the things that we need to cover, within the approach of this is, how does all this work? What does HITRUST do that just doing a standard risk assessment doesn't do? We talked about the evidence piece, and we're going to get more into that in a little bit when we get into the process. But it allows you to bring all of this, these frameworks and all of this, compliance needs into one umbrella. It gives you the MyCSF tool, which allows you to work, within the individual frameworks, to say, hey, I'm good here, or I'm good here, and I'm good there. There are some gaps in that process, and that's where tools like ZenGRC come in, because it allows us the ability to sit there early on in the process and say, okay, I'm not only looking at an E1, but I am going to be doing a SOC 2, or I'm going to be doing an ISO, or I got PCI controls, or I have whatever. We can start building out those frameworks in there and help you manage your enterprise compliance program easier. With HIPAA, doing it back to back, or doing it as an overlap with HITRUST, the 99% of what the HIPAA requirements are all going to be covered in the base controls for the E1. So, we want to make sure again that, you're not going out there and doing double work, and you're getting efficiencies out of what needs to be done. So, we also, want to make sure that, the evidence that you're providing again is reusable. It makes sense. We're not having people run around, chasing their tail, looking for evidence time and time again. And then the last piece of that is to make sure that it's mapped correctly, and that the evidence does actually meet what the standard's requiring you to do. All right, let's get in the process, and I'm going to let Megan do some talking here, because my mouth's starting to get dry, and it's I'm saying a lot of words here, and it's time for her to get involved. But so as we go through the process, pretty much from a approach perspective, we've got things that we need to do as the assessor. We've got to assess the scope. We've got to look at where the holes are, where the gaps are, help you remediate the gaps, or advise with you on what those remediation efforts need to be. And then we got to do the assessment work, collect the evidence, do all that kind of stuff. So how does all this work? Well, in a lot of cases, we want to work with organizations that have tooling in place. So when we're looking at, starting early on in the gap process, we want to be able to bring in a partner like ZenGRC to be able to look at, hey, here's where, here's the review of the controls. Here's what the client said they do for these. Do they actually meet the control? Do they not meet the control? Where's the gap, or is it ready to go? So we can start from that approach, and then we build hand in hand along the way. So we want to try to build that syncing, through the process, to make sure that the tooling that's being used is bringing in the appropriate evidence, and we're tracking it. So with that, Megan, do you want to add anything to that part of
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sean. This chart I think represents a lot of what our current customers have seen from the old use case prior to adopting ZenGRC to now the adoption of ZenGRC. And by that I mean it's the thing that we've uncovered the most is most organizations, they don't have an evidence problem. What they truly have is an evidence management problem. So you know the files exist, you know that people have them. They just typically could be spread across SharePoint, Teams, Google Drive. Basically, they're everywhere. I've even heard of, oh well, it's written down on a piece of paper. So that kind of gives you more context of the evidence management problem. So within ZenGRC, we're able to take all of that data from your stored repositories, pull it into ZenGRC, and then be able to apply those artifacts or pieces of evidence across your controls or other objects like policies so that you then can really prove if I say I'm doing it, I am. I'm now managing my data a little bit better. And you are able to reuse that evidence as you see fit. So the value that a lot of our current customers are seeing having a platform to contain all of those artifacts in one place is you're not having to collect more evidence, right? It's knowing that your evidence, it already exists and it's already able to be reused. So really giving that level of assurance.
And I think one of the key things there, and as somebody who's been doing this a long time, back in the day, we used to have spreadsheets where we had all the different controls of the frameworks, and I had to sit there and look at, okay, this control says organizations got to do this, this, and this, and then this control says organizations got to do this, this, and this, but also that, that, and that. And it became very hard to map all that together, to sit there and say, all right, does this piece of evidence work for this? Does it work for that? What else do we need to do? And in a lot of cases, we would go back and again ask for the same thing time and time again, and just have like little like tweaks to it. So one of the things that we like to do early on in the process is look at what evidence requirements are out there, and what commonalities or what efficiencies can we build in that. So if I'm going to get an access list of all your users, I want to make sure that not only do I have the access list of all the users, maybe there's additional things I need to know from that there, hire dates, termination dates, background investigation dates, did they do their training? Did they, things like that. So I can go out and ask for that piece of evidence with all those caveats or all those individual elements to it, as opposed to going out and saying, okay, now I'm going to need 5 separate lists that has, give me a list of all your users. Now give me a list of all your users that had training. Now give me a list of all your users who, were hired in the last year and terminated in the last year. So, we're looking for that mapping and that efficiency process to take place. And, tools like ZenGRC make that so much easier. At any point, we can sit there and click on the framework and say, okay, here we're compliant, at this point here, or we still have these gaps, but this control, covers, these, or this process or task covers these controls in HITRUST or covers these controls in SOC. So when you answer the question or you upload the evidence and it gets reviewed, you're not only doing it for the single framework, you're doing it for all the frameworks that you've applied to your assessment. Um, when we look at those efficiencies, it's amazing how much faster that works, for not only the client but also for us. HITRUST gives us 90 days to collect all the evidence in an E1, an I1, and an R2. And we have to collect the evidence, we have to review it, make sure it's the right evidence, we have to compare it to the control, evaluate it, and then score it. And we have 90 days to get all that done in. And then on top of that, we have to make sure that, we have all your documentation correct. We've got to make sure all your submission documentation's correct, make sure everything's spelled correctly, go through our internal QA, and then submit it to HITRUST to go through their QA. So that 90 days melts away very quickly. And having tools like this to be able to go in and organize all that is a massive, massive efficiency win. And it allows us to get through these assessments faster, cleaner, and let's face it, before we get to the point where we're submitting this to high trust, we can look at it and say, hey, we're extremely optimistic. You're actually passing this thing. We can look at what the scoring is. We can look at the ability to say, hey, if you go do the E1, and then we add in, these additional controls, you can get your SOC 2 type 2 with that as well, or you can get, an ISO, 27001, with doing these additional controls. So it gives us those capabilities where, if we're doing it manually, we'd have to literally get into silos and build this thing separately. Okay, where are we? So let's jump into AI a little bit, and then we'll come back to the tooling piece of this. But AI is the new buzzword. It's say new buzzword. It's been going on now for about 5 years in my world, and I think the majority of the world's been pretty much knee deep in AI in the last two or three. But what we look for from an AI perspective is two different aspects of it. One is, how is the organization using AI to improve or embed into their applications, their systems, their management? Are you using it for coding? Do you have tools that have AI built into it? So we're looking at that. So we're looking at what they call, the AI risk management framework. And what we want to determine from there is what due diligence needs to be performed in order to make sure that side of the fence is safe. If you're using it for coding, what tools are you using out there? Is it tools that have open-ended libraries that allow pretty much anybody to put anything in there, which is very risky, or have you created your own LLM and you're controlling that, tightly? If it's a third party, where are they getting it from and how are they managing it? So what we've done is myself and one of my directors a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, HITRUST came to us and created a group and said we need to write AI security controls that frame organizations to use AI not only in the production and management and development of their applications, but also the other side of the fence that give you controls and constraints around how AI is being used in your organization. And this would be things like your chat bots and people going out and writing documents and things like that using external AI in representation of your organization. So we went out and we helped HITRUST develop basically these two different frameworks. One is the AI RMF, which covers that first piece of it. How is it being implemented? What are you doing to secure it? Things like that. Where is it all being fed from? Everything else. And then the other side of it is more of a practical end user control side, where how is AI being used in your organization? And then we build a certification around that latter part of it. So what we have the ability to do now is, with your base security review, is we can take a look at these AI controls based off of what you do, implement those into the control set, load those into ZenGRC, and treat it just like any other control. And be able to manage that and be able to report back on where you are with it. With the HITRUST AI RMF, it's not a certification because it's just a risk management program, but it does work very seamlessly with the ability to do to manage your risk program, and it gives you coverage in your risk program for reporting and tracking and things like that. The AI certification, that's actually a certification, and we can talk more offline if anybody's interested in doing that. We can actually do the AI certification outside of a full-blown HITRUST assessment. We still do the E1 with it because the foundational controls still need to be done, but we can just do the AI certification portion of that. And then on top of all that, you take and you put all this stuff into the ZenGRC tool, and it has its AI built into it. And I'll let Megan talk a little bit about some of the stuff that
Yeah.
the capabilities are there that they've built into the tool from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I think what you're really bringing up too, that I've started to notice in the space with AI is that it's starting to become less of that technology discussion and more of a governance discussion, while also making compliance work dramatically more efficient. And that's really where the ZenGRC Gracie AI Copilot comes into play. So if you going off on the topic of evidence collection. Our AI can parse your evidence collection and at the control assessment if there is a gap. So, a good example is password complexity. If the requirement your control is mapped to is saying your password policy or your control language needs to say 14 uh, characters at minimum, and your evidence proves that it's 12 and you're not really meeting the full requirement, it will then give you actionable items to create another request for updated policy information or policy language, right? So that's one area that we're seeing AI be able to, again, not just make that compliance work dramatically more efficient, it's also helping that governance become dramatically more important in helping organizations to stay on top of that, especially when those executives are no longer really asking if my employees are using AI anymore. They're probably going to start asking more of, hey, can we prove that it's being governed accurately? So those are just a couple of areas in which ZenGRC can help leverage AI to your organizational advantage.
It's interesting to see the transition, especially over probably a little
Mhm.
bit more than a year now, going from, like you were just saying, are
Yeah.
are my employees using it to, oh my God, are my employees using it? What are they doing?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Has
Exactly.
anybody checked
Mhm.
this? Do we know what's going out? And we're seeing it a
Right.
lot. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
going into this webinar today, we were having a joke because there was a banner that was created for this webinar that was AI was used, and it did not use Megan and my picture in it. It used somebody else's. I don't know who these people are. If they're real people, sorry, we stole your pictures.
Yeah,
But our marketing teams, we didn't know that. And
yeah.
but it's that's just one example of, if you don't have the protocols in place and the processes in place to ensure that it's being used effectively, little things like that can become big things. And especially if you're using it, representing your organization, again, writing papers or things like that. But then also now we're dealing with, almost every single tool out there from a security perspective and even development perspective has AI in it. So, Arctic Wolf and, some of the bigger, tools out there, they're using AI now to scan networks and look for vulnerabilities and, fix stuff in some cases. We have tools out there that I've seen, that you load them up and they'll manage the whole network for you. A little scary,
Yeah.
because we don't really know what that tool, what that tool's doing, or, it doesn't tell us what it's doing. It tells us what it did. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of times the fix was probably worse than what the actual problem was. But we have to be very conscious of how this stuff's being implemented, and we have to have rules around that. And again, it's everything down to, controlling, in the employee handbook, the usage of chatbots and things like that they use every day now, to, implementing this technology into the backbone of your organization. So again, that's what all this is really about. Megan, do you want to run through how, like, all this works? So,
Yeah.
when we get to, hey guys, you need to do this, we're going to do this. What do we do? How does all this come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the way that I like to describe ZenGRC for those who are on the webinar who don't really have much context as to ZenGRC other than it is a GRC platform, I like to think of ZenGRC as not only your system of record, but it also is your system of action, as you'll see outlined here. And then the end result becomes your system of truth. So, then ZenGRC how we've helped our customers from the onboarding and implementation side of the house is take their common control set and then apply that to the applicable requirements that they know inevitably are going to be tested. And within ZenGRC, we are able to assign ownership to those specific control owners, whether they're individuals or whether they are a group of individuals who collectively are working on gathering the artifacts and the evidence for that control. Now, when we move into that collection of evidence, then GRC, I feel, is a unicorn in the space. And what I mean by that is because not only are our users able to use very manual, hands-on workflows, a lot of these customers are going to be those ones who are preparing to just become more comfortable with the tool, comfortable with their own processes, especially if they've changed them to make them more efficient. They can do that manual hands-on initiative first as they start gearing up for more of the automation side of the house. And what this means from the automation side of the house is ZenGRC does allow users to connect into one of 117 plus connections to then automatically fetch evidence. So now what you've done is you've removed a lot of that heavy lifting and a lot of that duplicative work on your team to be able to go out, fetch the evidence on a cadence that is necessary for that controls testing procedures, and go ahead and start gathering the artifacts, collect them, house them in an evidence library so that once you've had your initial review of is this sufficient evidence, is this the right evidence, then you can start getting ready for building the case of, okay, now we're launching our audit, right? And then after that's all said and done, after you've gone through your testing, ZenGRC allows a lot of our users to create numerous style reports. So not just at the audit level where I can report off of where I'm standing from my control assessment, or level of completion against my request, or were there any issues. I can report off that. I can create a PDF report and share it to my executive leadership. I'll also be able to get a glimpse and understanding of not just my control health per the control assessment, but now I can apply that to the requirements that they're mapped to. So I get a better understanding of requirement wise, am I on target? That then gets rolled up to the program health. So now you've created a lot of reporting and a lot of visibility into your overall compliance posture that you can easily report off of. And then, as mentioned earlier, again, not only is it the system of record, it's your system of action and now your system of truth to tie everything back together.
Yep. And I do want to point out, because a lot of times organizations get lost in the concept that the tool is my golden ticket or my security blanket. It's the best thing in the world, and it's going to do all this for me, and that's not true. Okay, I hate to break it to all the GRC tool salesmen out there. Your tool is not going to do everything that needs to be done, but good solid tools like ZenGRC will help in that process. I mean, we still come back to, as the auditor, I'm always looking at quality of evidence. The quality of the evidence is what drives the assessment. Organizing it, collecting it, making sure it does, it covers that. That's things that we can do, and these tools do help do that. One of the great things that I have seen with Zen is the ability to, in that early stage, is to look at the control and say, hey, this evidence looks good, or this evidence does look like it meets not only the primary control objective, but the actual elements within the control. And that's key. If you're out shopping for tools like this, we want to make sure that you're working with a tool that'll do that, because the efficiency, again, built into that makes life so much easier. It makes the process so much faster. And I'm a little selfish. It makes the audit easier as well. If I have confidence that the evidence being provided is pretty strong, my auditors only have to go in and look at it and say, yeah, test it. Yep, that looks good. We'll score it and move on. If we got to go searching for bits and pieces of a control that's not necessarily covered in the evidence, or it wasn't explained well, and the organization didn't provide the right amount of evidence, that creates a lot of back and forth and rework, and it just wastes a lot of time. So again, we want to make sure that when you're looking at these tools, look at the quality of what the process is. If you're working with an assessor, ask your assessor about it and say, hey, are you familiar with this tool and the workflow? And does that actually fit with what you guys do? Because we all do it a little bit differently. Okay. So I just want to give a quick example, use case here of a client that we've worked together with Zen GRC on, and it's a success story. But I'll tell you right now, there were problems. There's always problems in clients, but the thing that we're looking at is what did we come, what came to us to start with, what did they bring to the plate, and where did we go with it? So we had a client that kind of a typical application, healthcare application client that collected personal data and private health information. And so they said we need to do this high trust certification thing, and we went back and forth at what level do they need to do it. They needed to do be HIPAA compliant, and we're saying, well, we could do an offline assessment, or we can build it into this here. And then they started talking about having to do additional things like looking at their vendor management program and looking at their overall risk program. So we said, hey, let's start here. Let's get a good starting foundation. Let's look at the E1. We'll look at HIPAA. We'll jump into some of the other stuff, and then, oh yeah, by the way, I think a couple weeks down the road, they're like, hey, we just got a requirement from one of our providers. We have to have a SOC 2 Type 2, and it's got to be done in the next year. So we kind of said, not a big deal. We can throw all this together and put it there. So we went through our process that we've talked about. I won't go through every step of it, but we did our readiness review and looked at our, where the gaps were and where the holes were. And there were problems there. The company didn't have, the appropriate policies where we needed them. It didn't have some of the tooling that needed to be put in place. But the good thing about it was, as we started this project, we got them introduced into ZenGRC, the tooling itself, and they were able to follow along very cleanly. We were to sit there and say, okay, for this control, you've got this, and this, but you still need this full implementation over here in order to get evidence for that. So they were able to look at those individual tasks, complete them, provide supporting evidence for us to review it and say, yeah, that looks good. When we get the audit, we'll get clean evidence for it, and then be able to manage through that gap process. One of the things that I liked about this client here, and it was really a good foundational start with it, was using the tool helped them get through their remediation efforts so much easier and cleaner. We saw in most cases, we'll see clients, we built it into our SOWs, our contracts. We'll give a client about 4 months after the gap is done, 4 months to remediate, at the E1 level. And that's about average of what we see. And in many cases, these are organizations that don't have a security program, have never looked at security until they were actually told by somebody, you've got to go do this and you got to have it done by the end of the year. What we liked about this was the fact that during that remediation process, where we're really not involved in it, this is on the client, this is with their IT departments or their MSPs, we were able to help guide them with what needed to be done, track progress as they were going through it, be able to look at their progress and their evidence and answer questions and advise directly to them on this. So that was definitely a huge bonus. And I believe with this one here, I think instead of the 16 weeks we had originally allotted for them, I think they got through their gap review in about 10 weeks. So we saw some efficiencies there, and we definitely saw getting through the process. And then the second part of that was, now they knew exactly what evidence needed to be collected. All that was documented there. We said, hey, here's what we need. Let's get our population files. We'll select our samples. And then here's all the things we need. Go start collecting it. Click on the control. Click on the upload the evidence, and it's there. And as soon as it's there, my team can start looking at it and making sure it's ready to go. So again, we had already built the client's understanding of how to use the tool and how to work through this process, and it just made it so much easier and smoother. And I do believe at the end of the day, we ended up getting through our 90-day test window probably in about 35, 36 days. So again, a much more efficient approach. the client had all the evidence long before, our due dates were there. So we were able to start reviewing and scoring a lot sooner. And when we finally got through our reviews and got it submitted to HITRUST, this client came back with zero QA tasks or zero issues. So essentially, everything that we saw inside the tool was adequate, met the control standards as they were being described, and they passed with flying colors. And it makes it a lot easier from that point going forward, because then now we've been able to sit there and show the organization you can do this. It's not as hard as everybody says it is. It's hard, but it's not as hard. And this is how we make it easier. So, going hand in hand with what we offer and using the tool, using the ZenGRC tool makes life so much easier for people.
And I think
Anything else
one
you
thing
want
that
to
I'll add to
add on there?
that. Yeah, one thing that I think I'll add to that too is I think there's a common misconception that in order to move fast and to move efficiently, you have to have a large security team. And from what I've seen, it's the organizations that do move the fastest are rarely the ones that have the biggest security team. They're the ones that have the clearest ownership. So when you're talking about the remediation of any kind of findings or anything like that, I think probably one of the benefits is, as well is the team was set up for success because they had that clear ownership in tandem with a solid platform to be able to conduct their work.
And that's actually a good transition into the next, couple slides here, because we always get asked about timelines. How long is it going to take? My CEO says I got to be done, in a week. Not going to happen, by the way. But we get mandates from some of the bigger providers and carriers, and these organizations have never done this before and everything else. And we try to build timelines, and a lot of it's guesswork because we don't know the organization, we don't know what they've done, we don't know where they are. So the key areas where we try to make sure that we have a good solid timeline and we stay on track with that timeline, or as we talked about in the example, we improve that timeline, is in these three specific areas where we want to make sure we focus on. Scoping, flat out, the number one problem we always run into. Organizations need to understand how the HITRUST assessment and certification process works. HITRUST, unlike almost all other frameworks, only certifies the environment, the application, or the combination of the two. They don't certify companies. So it's not like your organization is HITRUST certified. You're not. It's the application or environment within your organization that underwent the assessment is certified. And this is a different approach than what we see with our SOCs and ISOs and some of our other frameworks out there. So we want to make sure we spend time up front with that scoping. That helps us determine what needs to be looked at, what systems, environments, locations, you name it, all that kind of stuff is up front, and we get that worked out. So once we have that hammered out, we lock that down, and then from time to time, we will see changes to that scope that we're like, oh, I didn't think about that. There is another data center, or there is something else that we got to include. And we'll try to react accordingly and try to make it, as easy as we possibly can to put that in there. But we want to try to get that locked down in the early stages of the assessment. The big piece here where we see delays is evidence collection. Organizations just don't know what to get. And it's hard for us as the assessor to go out there and tell them what evidence to get. We can read them the control, we can kind of interpret what the control means, but it's their SMEs that need to make the determination. Oh, that's requiring me to do this, and I have this tool that I use to do that. Can I get evidence out of that? So one of the great things that we've been able to see, especially like we were just talking about going through the gap process with ZenGRC, is the identification of that evidence as we're going through the gap process. So we'll say, hey, this is the control, this is what the control means. Do you guys do this? And somebody on your team will sit there and say, yeah, we do that. Or no, we don't. And I'll say, okay, if you do that, do you use a tool? Where does it, what's the environment? Where does it live? What evidence can you produce that shows compliance with this control. And they'll sit there a lot of times and say, oh, I can go into this tool and I can pull this report and it'll give me everything we need to know there. It covers all these things. Or you know what, it only covers three of those things, but these other two things I can go get from over there. And that is huge in the early stages as well, during that gap process, because then what happens is we can identify that as the evidence for that control that needs to be collected. And we can put a task in and saying, okay, when we get to, validating this control, go get that report and look at it this way. And that makes life so much easier. As I talked about in the example, we were able to pull 100% of that evidence in a matter of days instead of a matter of weeks. And then, one of the other nice things that you'll see with ZenGRC is, as Megan mentioned, all those API connectors that go out and grab all this evidence. So, if you're out in AWS and we're going to need to see, your firewall configs, you can put that information in, it'll connect through the APIs to AWS, go pull all the config information, bring it all back and load it into the control as part evidence. So we're not going and looking for that evidence anymore. It's been provided. So those are key things that we want to look at there. And then the last piece of this here is the remediation and incubation underestimated. And it's really, as I talked about, how long is it going to take you to fix this? And then there's a caveat with HITRUST. Anything that you change in the environment or anything that you add new, if you didn't have, I like using my SIM example. You didn't have a SIM out there. You guys were just going out and you pull your own logs, but you got to have a SIM. So you got to go implement one. So we go look at CrowdStrike or we look at Arctic Wolf or whoever, and we go find a SIM. That's got to be in place 90 days. It's got to be operational in your environment for 90 days before the assessor can pull evidence and look at it. So we want to make sure, again, we identify that up front. So if we see a gap in some of these core controls that require tooling that you don't have, we want to address those as early as we possibly can. Because in many cases, you got to go through an evaluation, a procurement process, an implementation, installation, configuration, all the other shuns out there. And, you got to make sure that it's running and it's effectively doing the job you needed to do. And we need to look at the evidence that it's producing to make sure that, this looks good and this is going to work for us. So, we've got, remediation that could take several months. And then if it's a new tool or new process, it's got to be out there for another 3 months, another 90 days. Well, that's 7 months of the year already, and we haven't tested a single thing yet. So again, we want to make sure that we concentrate in those key areas to try to build these efficiencies in and plan the appropriate time to fix and implement and do the things we need to do. With E1s and I1s, there's not a heavy documentation requirement with it. There is some policy and procedure that's required with it. The very first control is, organization must have an information security management plan. That's a policy. So, even though HITRUST will sit there and tell you, yeah, there's no policies or procedures required in an E1. Well, the very first control says there is. But we'll help you, navigate that, write the appropriate documentation and get that stuff in. But we really want to concentrate on the heavy lifts. Where's the tooling? Where's the configuration? And make sure we build that into that remediation plan so that we can limit the effort and the weight, really. You get into this incubation period and everybody's sitting there twiddling their thumbs for 3 months waiting for the clock to tick. So we want to make sure that we're covering all that. All right. So as we're getting close to wrapping things up, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about next steps and what you need to do. So I like building a 90-day action plan. When we're looking at starting a project, if you're looking at starting a project, the very first thing we have to do is sit down with you, talk about the options, what you need to do, when do you need to do it. And we got to do that quickly, because again, we don't want to burn the clock where we don't need to. And we want to make sure that, everybody's clear on what the goals are going to be. So, engage with us, get things rolling. And then what we'll do is we'll sit down and we'll talk about the scope. That, like I said, that's the really big piece of this. What do we do in those first 30 days? We go through, we learn your system. By the end of this process, we probably know more about your systems and your organizational workflows than you guys do. Um, then we get into, the next phase of this will be mapping the controls and doing the assessment, the readiness portion of this, and that's that gap review and piece of that there. But we want to make sure everybody understands, this is how it unfolds. The tool lays over top of all this, and we try to incorporate that as much as we possibly can. And then the last piece, before we get into the assessment piece, is the remediation and tightening things up and making sure we have the appropriate documentation and the evidence is being produced. So every client has to kind of go through this process. So those first 90 days are really let's see what you need to do. What do you have to, spend money on? What can you save money on? Who do you got to get? Who do you got to engage internally? Who you got to engage externally? And we'll work you through, and that's where we come in and we handle, that white gloving of that process there. But again, a lot of this is really just making sure that those first 2, 3 months are setting you up for success to get through this. You're going to spend a lot of time, effort, and money on this, and we don't want it to be wasted. One of the great things that I get to claim as a high trust assessor, we are a certified high trust assessor. We are the only assessor in the world that has a 100% certification rate. Every customer that comes to us gets certified. It may be painful, it may take a little bit longer, but we don't give up on you if you don't give up on us. And we'll get you there. And we rely heavily on good process, good tools like ZenGRC. We rely very heavily on partnerships. If things aren't looking good or we can't figure out how to do something, we'll pick up the phone and call somebody and scream and yell, why is this happening? But we're very good at what we do. We have a lot of success doing this. So what do? I'll break it up for you very easily. My side of the fence, strategy, scoping, readiness, assessment, guidance. I'm your assessor. Okay, I'm your auditor. Let's put it that way. I'll help you in the early stages getting prepped and getting ready for it, and then I'll bring an audit team in that actually does the actual certification portion of this. We'll work with you on understanding the controls. I have HIPAA and security controls interpretation laid out here, but it's really any framework. It doesn't really matter what you do and what frameworks you bring into this. We're gonna handhold you through this. We're gonna literally sit down on phone calls with your SMEs and walk you through. This is what the control means. And do you understand what the control means? Do you get it? We're going to look at your evidence. We're going to review the quality of the evidence, tell you where to tighten it up, where to make it look good. And we're going to look at the overall process. How is it progressing? Is it going in the direction it needs to be going? How's it working? And we are your advocate in a lot of this here too, because we become your partner, especially in the early readiness stages. So we're your partner to make sure that Zen's doing their job, that your MSP is doing their job, that your team's doing their job. Because at the end of the day, if one piece of that isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's gonna slow down or cause the project to fail. Meg, you want to run through what you guys do? I don't want to talk for you.
Yeah,
Enough.
absolutely. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, so as we talked about it earlier, ZenGRC is think of it as your system of action where you can house your common control framework and those requirement mappings, and then not just map the controls to your requirements, but other areas of the platform as well, right? And with that, as we start talking about controls, then ZenGRC also becomes that system of action where we start collecting your evidence. You're able to assign ownership to the appropriate control owners or teams that might need to do those issue remediation or finding remediations. And as such, that does tie into the workflows that you're able to create within ZenGRC to allow those owners to be able to work seamlessly. And then reflect back that work from a myriad of dashboard reporting. So when we start talking about not just the evidence collection and the audit functionality, a lot of times that does go hand in hand with your risk issues and remediation tracking, all again, which are included in ZenGRC as their each individual module within the platform, again, seamlessly tied and connected back to other areas of the platform. And finally, not only is it that system of record, system of action, it's your system of trust. So your leadership, whether it's legal, security, compliance, they can also have their own unique views and get a glimpse into your GRC universe within Zen.
Awesome. All right, so we're getting close to time here, and I want to make sure that we get the last couple of bullet points in, and then open up to any questions. Um, so wrap everything up. For next steps, look at your organization, figure out what you need. If you're looking at needing high trust specifically, a HIPAA assessment, any you have AI stuff, you don't even know where to begin with that. That's kind of the indicator. Hey, let me pick up the phone, call these guys, and let's have a conversation about it. Once we go through that process, we'll look at, identifying what controls are applicable and kind of build out that whole roadmap. Where do you got to go and when do you got to get there? Then we'll build in our readiness plan and then we'll talk about the tooling side of this. What do you got to do? We'll get engaged with ZenGRC on getting you guys set up, get an object created, and get things going. But I think the initial step right now is make the determination on what do you need today? What do you need help with? And it may not even be high trust at the end of the day. We may sit back and say, you know what, you guys are probably pretty good, or there's no requirement to do that. Let's work on building it up. And I make the joke all the time, I'm the worst salesman in the world. My sales staff can't stand it because I talk customers out of a lot of stuff. Especially if I don't think they need it, because it's just ridiculous to go do things you don't need. If you absolutely need to go down this path, we're gonna like I said, we're gonna take you by the hand and we're gonna drag you down the path. But if you don't, I'm gonna talk you out of it. Um, Megan, any closing remarks before I open up for questions?
Yeah, I think one of the closing remarks that I would have to add to that is compliance isn't necessarily becoming simpler. I think regulations are becoming more interconnected, which you touched a lot on today in the webinar. And I truly do believe that organizations that build a reusable compliance foundation now are going to be so much better positioned than an organization that's going to continue treating every framework as a separate project. So with that, I'll leave you with that and open it up for questions.
All right, so we do have a couple questions that came in. I'll try to get through a couple of these here, and we'll answer these and send out emails after the fact. But one is we're already HIPAA compliant. We're already a HIPAA compliance program. Why would we consider high trust E1? Chances are, if you're a HIPAA or if you're required to do HIPAA, you're probably doing something along the lines with PHI. High trust is going to give you a much higher level of assurance. HIPAA's good, but it's not great, and it doesn't cover everything that needs to be covered, and it doesn't um, put any precautionary standards out there. So it's just going to make sure that you're managing the privacy side of the house and you have protocol in place for a lot of things. But high trust brings in the program to actually help you manage this and put in prevention. Because again, ultimately, at the end of the day, our big problem is we don't want to breach. So we don't want somebody getting access to what we have been put in charge to protect. And if we don't have a good solid security program, that's going to happen to you. It's going to happen. The big reason there, why should we get on the high trust track? The real question is why wouldn't you? Um, it's a huge security risk not to have these kind of standards in place and have some level of checking within your organization that holds you accountable to these things. And HIPAA's just not that. HIPAA's going to give you a list of standards that you can follow, but nobody's really following up with you until something bad happens. So high trust is proactive. The other question I'll run into is high trust intended to replace SOC 2, or do organizations typically maintain both? The answer to the question is yes, yes, no, no, and yes, no, maybe. And what I mean by that is it is a SOC 2 compliant or I wouldn't say compliant, but compatible or comparable framework. And in many cases, I think HITRUST is more efficient and more drilled into the specific environment than a SOC 2 is. SOC 2s tend to be, well, SOC 2s are opinion based. So depending on who's doing it for you and the level of assessment that they're doing, you're getting a non-security professional to give you an opinion on whether or not you have implemented a control effectively and that your organization is safe by doing what they think you should be doing. HITRUST goes the other direction with that. They require you to be compliant with it and to prove that you're compliant with it. And there's several levels of checking to make sure that you are. It starts with us as the assessor, and then it ends with HITRUST going in and doing their QA process where they validate not only, did I do my job, but are you actually compliant based on what the control says that you're supposed to be doing? So is it to replace SOC 2? Not necessarily. But it in many cases it does and it will. And going into the near future, I think we'll see more HITRUST E1s in replacing SOC 2, especially SOC 2 Type 2s. But again, it depends on what the client needs it for. And in a lot of cases, the second part of that question is yes, clients do tend to maintain both. I believe between a SOC 2 Type 2 and a standard HITRUST R2 assessment, I think there's only 5 controls uh, in HITRUST that aren't covered, or in SOC 2 that aren't covered by HITRUST, and they're financial related controls. HITRUST doesn't really cover the financial side unless we put those in. So yeah, it could it be could it be done in tandem? Absolutely. Most of the evidence, the majority of the evidence for HITRUST more than exceeds the need of what SOC 2 requires. So if you are going to do HITRUST and SOC 2, I would definitely say do HITRUST first or do them, in tandem with each other. Most of the evidence that's collected for SOC 2 Type 2 does not meet the evidence requirements for HITRUST. So, if you're going to do them, do HITRUST first. All right. We will address any additional questions that we have here. I actually got a few more that came in, and we'll send that out with the slide deck for everybody. If anybody has any questions or wants any follow-up, please reach out to myself or Megan, and we'll definitely be willing to jump on a call with you and talk about what next steps are. So I appreciate everybody and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.